So hi everybody. I would like to welcome you to the fourth GLP webinar on co-production in the field of land system science. My name is Isabel Providoli. I work at the International Program Office of the Global Land Program based at the Center for Development and Environment of the University of Bern. This webinar is hosted by GLP and supported by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. I will be moderating this webinar jointly with my colleague Albrecht Ehrensberger, who is also from CDE. But before we start, I would like to give you an overview of the webinar series we had so far. So we had a first webinar in June. It was an introductory webinar setting the stage about co-production in the field of land system science. Then we had two webinars illustrating practical examples about different methods. So one was on adaptive landscape approaches using role-playing games. And the second one was about modeling, scenario building, and forecasting. So today we will hear a practical example about the use of spatial analysis and mapping tools. And this practical example series will then be followed by a fifth webinar, which will be a synthesis of the whole series. And we will be elaborating jointly a change theory for co-production of sustainable land systems. And that will happen early next year. And before we start today, I would also like to share some housekeeping rules. So all of the attendees have been muted, so your microphones are automatically muted. That's to avoid side noise. And we also would like to give you the opportunity that you can ask questions to our panelists. So you have a questions window or a questions box where you can submit the questions you have. And if you have any technical problems, please write to me by using the question box as well. But now I would like to give the floor to Albrecht Ehrensberger from CDE, who will provide an introduction to this webinar series. So Albrecht, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Hold on, I cannot see it myself. Now it's okay. Okay, so a warm welcome from my side as well. I'm very glad to be part of this fourth webinar session in our series. And just for information, this morning at 11 o'clock Central European time, we had 205 registrations. As for now, we are around 60 attendees and the numbers are still climbing. So it looks like the topic of today is of high interest to the GLP community. And after seeing these numbers this morning, I quickly checked in the database of the registered GLP members, and I found that out of around 1,000 scientists who have registered there, roughly 600 indicated that they are using GIS as a method. Around 550 have indicated that they use spatial analysis, and 450 have indicated that they are using remote sensing as one of their methodologies. So this seems to make sense because land systems are inherently spatial, even though telecoupling across long distances tend to blur this notion. Therefore, it seems logical that spatial analysis and mapping tools have particularly high potential in supporting the co-design of sustainable land systems. As an introduction, I would like to propose three statements or kind of hypothesis on the potentials of spatial analysis and mapping tools in the context of co-production of sustainable land systems. And I suggest that the attendees keep these hypotheses at the back of their minds as they listen to the three speakers in order to identify which of the three potentials seems to be the most prominent. You can give your feedback and opinion on them through the question window, and I will do my best to forward your questions and suggestions to the three speakers. So the first statement points to the technical strength of spatial analysis tools. For example, this is the ability of such tools to process large amounts of data and visualize them in an easily understandable way. You have one example here, a map of poverty incidence in Laos. Or it's also the ability of these tools to integrate local stakeholders in something that is rather high-tech, and to enable them to participate in the data and information generation process. This can be done through mapping or the use of GPS and other technologies. The second statement is about the ability of spatial analysis and mapping tools to enhance the transparency of participatory processes and the commitment of participants to such processes. When something is mapped to the right scale in a multi-stakeholder process, this has a binding character. The photo on the right, or the picture on the right, shows a map of the ancestral territories of an ethnic minority group in Kenya. The map was done using topographic baseline maps and the GPS. Borders are precise, and they needed to be negotiated with neighboring clans. The map was signed, you can see, by the elders of the Gapshoi clan, giving it an at least semi-official status, and therefore a more reliable and transparent discussion and negotiation basis than a sketch map. The third statement points to the ability of mapping tools to achieve knowledge integration and making tacit knowledge explicit. This means that they are capable of integrating different types of knowledge that are based on different epistemologies. A map can contain elements that were included by scientists, other that were included by a policymaker, and yet others that were included by a villager. Each will have the same value and status on the map. Whether the person who inserted the element on the map is literate or illiterate doesn't really matter. Furthermore, mapping tools can help making tacit knowledge explicit. This means that knowledge that is based on experience or belief and may be difficult to capture in words that are universally understandable can be made visible on a map and thereafter included in a discussion or a negotiation process. Let us see what our three speakers will have to tell us about these thoughts, which I must add I have not shared with them beforehand. So first, we will hear Johan Bastide, who is based in Myanmar and is the director of the One Map Myanmar project. His presentation will give us insights into multi-stakeholder processes for land conflict resolutions. Next, we will hear Michael Uwemedimo, who is based in Nigeria and who is the director of the CMAP project in Port Harcourt. His presentation will, among other things, highlight the potential of mapping tools for the empowerment of marginalized urban communities. Finally, we have the pleasure to welcome Giacomo Rambaldi, who has been one of the pioneers of Participatory GIS and is currently working at the Center for Agricultural and Rural Cooperation in the Netherlands. He will give us insights into his long experience, which he will illustrate with examples of participatory 3D modeling in the Pacific region. With one speaker in Myanmar and another one in Nigeria, we took a bit of a risk in terms of internet connectivity. This is why they appear in this particular sequence. If the connection should break down with Myanmar or Nigeria, we will switch to Giacomo while we try to solve the problem. And now I would like to give the word to Johan to briefly introduce himself, his project, and then to give his presentation.
Thank you, Albert. Good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm in Yangon at the moment, and it's night time. So my name is Joan Bastide. As Albert said, I'm heading the Center for Development and Environment office here in Myanmar. I've been here for 3.5 years, and I'm also running this One Map Myanmar project, which I will explain a little bit. There's a lot of exciting activities that we have under this project. So of course, as always, I want to say too much. So I've prepared 2 different case studies, which I'm not sure I will be able to cover. So I might stop after the first one. It's always very confusing to talk to our own screen, knowing that there's almost 100 people on the other side. So this is how my presentation goes. I'll first give you a very short introduction of One Map Myanmar initiative and the land governance context in Myanmar. And then I'll focus on either 2 or 1 of these 2 work streams that we are currently working on and that speak to the topic of co-production of spatial data. One is a multi-stakeholder land use assessment regarding oil palm plantations in the south part of the country. And the second one is trying to use those participatory approaches to protect customary tenure in Nagaland area. So basically the land governance context in Myanmar, I'm not going to go into details, but as usually it's very complicated, it's very hectic. In the country, land issues are a very important topic. People talk a lot about it. There's a huge amount of land disputes across the country, and this speaks to certain weaknesses of the institutions, the legal system. There's not much data out there available to make decisions, and all these kind of issues that we face in many other countries. But 2 things that are very important to understand the Myanmar context is that there's very unbalanced power relationships between the different actors involved in land, with on one hand the militaries that keep a lot of power versus the civilian government and very powerful economic actors, and in the middle there's the smallholder farmers who sometimes have a very few levers to actually make their claim their voice in the national debate. And also it's a very highly conflictive context in the sense that it's one of the longest standing civil war in the country that it's been running for over 60 years, not only between 2 groups, but between a few dozen ethnic armed groups and the central government, as well as between those different groups. In this context, there's a very high prevalence of land disputes. So this is the context in which One Map Myanmar is operating. So it's a long-term project. It's 8 years that is funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And we mostly work on these different components that I've tried to illustrate on the right side of the screen, really trying to help build better data, that the data has better quality, but is also more accessible to the public. On the other hand, we also work a lot with a huge diversity of actors to really try to increase their technical capacities in using all these technologies, GIS mapping, spatial analysis, within the government, but also working very closely with civil society groups, ethnic groups, and so on. And then we really try to build on this data and these increased capacities to produce some knowledge that is relevant for ongoing policy and decision-making processes that are ongoing in the country. And all of that is articulated around this big national data platform that we are establishing and that we are about to launch in the next weeks. So a national data platform on land and other natural resources. It's a bit different from most other development projects in the sense that it's fully embedded within the government. So this is basically the structure of the land governance within the government. And as you can see, we are sitting here. So right under this National Land Use Council, which is chaired by this gentleman on the right, who is the Myanmar Vice President. So we are really embedded within the land governance landscape, and One Map brings together 25 different agencies across 11 different ministries to try to really work together towards better data integration, towards more effective coordination mechanisms between the different agencies when it comes to managing land resources. So that really puts us in a position where we can somehow influence quite effectively some of the ongoing decision-making processes. So now let me zoom to this first case that I wanted to cover. So that is the situation. Back in the 90s or early 2000, suddenly the military regime wanted to achieve self-sufficiency in edible oil. So they identified this southern part of the country as the most suitable to actually promote large-scale palm oil plantations. So the decision was made, and then they started distributing the land to some of the companies without much consideration for the reality on the ground, like the local claims of local villagers, the biodiversity, the presence of intact forest, and all these things. And that's what it looks like now. So all these areas have been granted to oil palm companies that in many cases had absolutely no experience in planting oil palm. So as you see, this is a huge amount of land. It's half of entire townships. It's hundreds of thousands of acres, and obviously there's people using this land. So it was done in a very untransparent manner, and the result of that is that there's a huge amount of land disputes in this region related to this oil palm industry. Further in the description of the situation, this is I hope you can see the green part is actually what has been planted with oil palm since the concession were granted. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of area that have not been utilized yet. And then when we started looking a bit beyond the boundaries of the concession, this is what you see in purple here, is oil palm that has been planted without any formal approval from the government. And then when we started digging a bit deeper in the maps, we saw that when we start overlaying, for example, other types of concessions, this is rubber, you see that there's overlap. So the same land has been given to two different companies for two different purposes. And then when we add the protected areas, we see that some of these overlap between two companies happens in protected areas where nobody's supposed to plant any of these crops. So this is just to show you the complexity of the situation that the government is facing. Now, in 2015, there has been general election. The National League for Democracy was elected. And one of the first moves that they made in this region was to really try to resolve these issues around the oil palm land disputes. And that's when they asked us to help them make an assessment of the situation so that they could identify which areas had not been utilized as per the contract, so that they could reclaim it back from the companies and then redistribute it to local communities or internally displaced population. So we were mandated to conduct this technical assessment, but then we realized that because of the two factors I mentioned before, the high conflictuality and the lack of trust between stakeholders and the way land issues are very sensitive, it would be much more effective to do it through a multi-stakeholder process. So the chief minister of the region gave us the blessing, and we helped her to establish this regional multi-stakeholder task force to conduct these assessments. So this was established, and this it's comprised of representatives from the regional government, so regional ministers and head of departments, civil society groups, oil palm companies, but also the Karen National Union, which is the ethnic armed group that is operating in this region. So all these stakeholders with very different worldviews came into the room and were part of this process. So we started basically working and we started producing data as group technocrats. So we went out there, we flew drones, we got satellite images, we digitized everything, we got access to the contracts of the concessions so that we could map the boundaries, and then we combine all this information, and we came back to the plenary very proud of our cutting edge technology and science. And when we showed the result to the audience, everybody started shouting and saying that they were not agreeing with any of the data we had produced. So that's where we realized that actually thinking the production of data just as us, the technical people, producing data and then submitting it to the crowd was actually not good enough. We had to involve them earlier in the process, as early actually as even the definition of which data should be collected, how, and based on which criteria, and how it should be digitized and shared, and all these different steps. So after this, we appointed local committees, which were comprised of the same constituents, which were responsible to actually carry out further investigation on all these data. And that's where we had these teams made of representatives from civil society, companies, and ethnic group and government going together, playing with the drone in the field, collecting a whole lot of data, verifying all the data where people would not agree on, is that oil palm or is it rubber, or any issue that people would not agree on. We would go to the field together, and throughout this process, we actually also spent a lot of time together in the field, sweating the entire day. So also it really helped building kind of a more cohesive team spirit. Then working with local communities. Drone is an amazing tool for that because everybody seems to love it. Then coming back to the room, printing those big maps, really looking at it, writing on it, discussing the different land issues, and coming up with some kind of a compromise in terms of what is what, so that the data that we produce can be really approved and validated by this multi-stakeholder mechanism. And then once we had all these data compiled and drawn on the vinyl maps, we also developed this online app, interactive map, where we've compiled all the data that we have generated, also the drone images, so that any member of the group can go on the platform, can click on the different polygons and see what it is, can look at the drone image at the back to see if what we have mapped as oil palm is really oil palm, so they can really make their own assessment of the situation and then provide feedback until we get to a final map that is approved by everybody, even if the worldviews, claims, and interests are very different. So that's how we've started. It's been 2 years since we've started this process. There's been a huge amount of challenges, of failures. There's also been great successes. It's been very complicated to actually maintain the momentum within the group, and the process is very iterative in the sense that it started from a very technical assessment, but very soon it starts speaking to more policy based discussion and review of existing policies and development of sectoral policies for the region. So through this iterative process, we really moved very quickly from a strictly technical kind of mandate to something that became much broader. I will not have time to present the second case. I will go to some of the conclusions that we have out of these processes. We've tried to theorize that a little bit. Basically, we're in a context where people don't really talk to each other. It's very conflictual. People have very different worldviews. So it's often very difficult to bring everybody around the table on such a on such a sensitive topic. But we realize more and more that map has this magic that you just put it on the table and people start talking and discussing and sharing information and perspectives. And so we call it the technical backdoor, really starting to address a very complicated topic through a very technical angle really helps actually to start the discussion. And once a critical mass of information and data has been collected, then we can really try to compile it, to integrate the data from different sources, to integrate the different perspectives, and then really use that to foster multi-stakeholder multi-stakeholder dialogue. And through the process, it becomes possible sometimes to start jointly implementing actions, like in the case of when we go to the field together, collect the data. And along the way, we learn a lot from this experience. People learn how to work together, and then we can address more and more sensitive topics. So where we stand in the process is that hundreds of thousands of acres of land has now been taken back from the companies. And now the big box of what to do with this land, how to redistribute it based on which criteria, is open. And that will be another very challenging chapter of this multi-stakeholder process that we have started here in Myanmar. And I will stop here. I think I'm off my time.
Okay, thank you very much, Joan. I will would just like to repeat the housekeeping rules, as some people have joined us later. So the microphones of all the attendees have been muted. Altogether, we have more than 70 attendees with us, and we are taking questions and answers through the question box. So please submit your questions to Joan in that box, and they will be taken up. And please, if you have any technical problems, also write to us, and we will try to assist. And as an information, the presentation will be shared with all of you, and the webinar will be recorded. So all of this will be available on the GLP website. And thank you for your attendance. And I will pass the word to Albrecht.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. Questions are starting to trickle in, but as we are a little bit behind time, I will maybe just take one and keep the others for the Q&A session at the end. So the first one to come in was asking about internet connectivity, Joan. The person is wondering how you handle the online data platform as you are operating from a place where internet connectivity is generally low. How do the beneficiaries have access to that data at all?
Yeah, so we have offline versions of these maps, but also the connectivity, the Wi-Fi and the 4G penetration rate is very fast in Myanmar at the moment. So in these areas, we can access rather good internet. But that's definitely a key issue for more remote areas, and in which case we try to replicate the tools offline. Or also, produce printed maps and these kind of products.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a second short question where you will give a short answer is, how did you deal with places where people were not agreeing with the land allocation?
That's pretty much everywhere. So we're not dealing with that per se, because it's not our responsibility to decide on that. But we're trying to help the group to actually make the case for the different claims, and then bring that to the table of this multi-stakeholder process where the discussion can happen.
Mm. Okay, I think we leave it at that for the moment because we are behind time. But I'm continuing to collect the questions that come in, and I will try to group them so that we can try to address all the concerns that are being raised. And now I would like to give the word to Michael and to tell us briefly who he is, and then to start his presentation.
Greetings. Hello, everybody out there, wherever you are. We're here in Port Harcourt, the oil capital of Nigeria, and we want to tell you a little story about the mapping component of our project. The project's called the Human City Project, which is a project that I try and support and give some direction to. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Shikoku Maps. It's a story in two parts. The first part by way of historical and urban context, violence by design. So, as I'm sure many of you out there know, this is a part of the world that for 500 years has been one edge of a global economy that spanned the Black Atlantic, a trade in dark cargo, first human beings, then palm oil, then coal, and now crude oil. And cartography has played a role in this structural violence. It played that role on a global scale through the transatlantic crossings and also the constitution of Africa as a space for the exploitation of colonial resources. The very constitution of the city where I'm speaking from, Port Harcourt, the constitution of this city as a crown possession was facilitated by mapping, a process of possession through dispossession. And this is the map in 1913 that brought together this tangle of creeks where there were various fishing villages and various farms into a city which was owned and part of the British Empire. Maps then continued to play a role when commercial oil was struck. This is a chart which comes from an archive in the Netherlands, and ostensibly it's a map drawn by a department of a newly independent Nigerian government, the Director of Geological Survey, drawn in 1962. But if you look carefully at the legend, you'll see that this map was in fact compiled from air and ground surveys drawn by Shell BP. So the map of Port Harcourt, the map of this area, is literally drawn by Shell. And the impacts of that have been quite profound on the water, on the land, on the wildlife. It's worth noting that 10% of Nigeria's oil economy, and it's the largest producer on the continent, is informal. It's produced in quaintly called artisanal refineries like this. And the impacts of those are huge. So this is the context of our city, Port Harcourt, a city in the creeks. It's a city marked by a structural violence which can be graphically seen in a single frame. And the material violence of extraction and the social violence of segregation is inscribed in the very master plan of the city. So here you see what was called the native quarter, the squat, tight barracks where the workers lived next to the dockyard. And here, the leafy setbacks of the European quarter, actually where I'm speaking from now. And all around this city, a city which was constituted to be a staging post for the extraction of colonial resources, the railway terminus for coal from Enugu and the deep sea port to take that coal around the coast, all around this city are these dense waterfronts. These are settlements that have been literally reclaimed from the creeks by throwing down Shikoku mud and refuse. Nearly 500,000 people, but all of these places were declared for demolition in 2009. And it's important to remember that this is not a peripheral condition, this is the core urban condition. 79% of all Nigerian city dwellers live in slum conditions. So this is the state of the nation, but there is no state engagement, no municipal provision of any kind. And so you see the kinds of issues that you associate with slums: overcrowding, lack of durable housing, sanitation problems, chronic insecurity, and stark inequality. In the face of this reality, the government imaginary, when faced with this, is this: a kind of pastoral petro-utopia. And on the ground, the impacts are the bulldozer. So these are the scenes that our project responded to. Scenes which were facilitated by mapping or enumeration. So in order to engage in a mapping program, we had to overcome that suspicion in the first place. And to do that, we had to tell another story. We had to create a space in which people could say, we live here. And that was how we started the Human City Project, an attempt just to let young people in, to remain rooted in the community, but to have an impact at city level, to move from social exclusion to participatory development. And to do that, we wanted to explore different forms of community voice. So we're developing a radio station, developing architectural interventions, a media center to give a shelter for that voice, and a participatory mapping program, which we'll look at closely today, which feeds into a series of pilot projects which support CDS, a city development strategy. So this, broadly speaking, is the structure of our project. The architectural component gets people thinking about building, about changing space. But for us, it was important that we didn't fetishize a building, that we always moved from the building to the site, to the neighborhood, to the city. We looked to Medellin for inspiration, for a kind of social urbanism which was predicated on changing the story about the city and promoting social and spatial integration. And so we started our mapping project. First, not starting with technical issues, starting with stories, starting with thinking about maps and power, the way in which maps don't simply describe a pre-existing reality, but produce space, constitute a reality. And we looked at colonial cartography and discussed how that power might be appropriated in various ways. We played games to get people to think about the very unnatural process of rendering space as an abstract field of Cartesian coordinates and flying above that space, abstracting your eye and flying above that space and placing yourself in it. We thought about map making as puzzle making, and then went out through a series of rough map makings to focus on our priorities. And the whole process, even developing the iconography, was participatory. We worked on the routes together and then sent people out into the communities on an initial mapping and numbering exercise where every single structure was indexed. We carried out visible attribute surveys, looking at infrastructure, looking at challenges, problems, and also strengths. Collated all of that, collected using Kobo Toolbox, open source, free, put it into QGIS, again, open source and free. And along the way, provided really significant technical training to our cohort. And out of that came a series of high quality maps, part of what we call a narrative geography, a way of not just going out and gathering data, but also sharing information, building networks, and telling stories. So this is just a series of images which show the outputs from some of the initial mapping rounds. And the making of these maps and the presentation of these maps are also an occasion to bring people together. We present them at town hall meetings. It gets very hands-on. People point out omissions, correct mistakes, and it's a way of increasing community cohesion and sharing the information that people need to develop a propositional relationship with duty bearers. So following that, we have a series of encounter and exchange programs. So here we have ostensibly two gang members who are actually also journalists and musicians, part of our project. And they are working closely with members of the security services, government representatives, around a solution-focused session to look at issues of security in this instance. So just very briefly to round up, I wanted to show you some images from the second phase of the project, where we responded to a call for a technical assistance program from the World Bank, and we won the bid. Oh, sorry, this is just something on singing and greening, because one of the dynamics which drives this project is the desire to develop a relationship between the co-production of open public debate and the co-production of open public space. So here we had a street choir at a tree planting ceremony. So here you just see some images and some of the focus groups and outputs from the transect walks that we carried out for the World Bank. And now we have what is certainly the richest database of any city in Nigeria on the sanitation situation. So it just shows that the participatory approach is not just a social gesture, but produces technically superior outcomes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that. Thank you very much. And if you want to learn more, you can look on our website or follow us on Twitter.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very impressive presentation. And I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. There was more a remark than a question, but I can still flag it to you and to Joan and Giacomo. Everybody is welcome to answer. The question of empowerment. The question came in actually before you started your presentation, and the person said that actually empowerment depends on how the technology is being used. The person then went on writing that you could very well be disempowering through a cynical deployment of the mapping tool. So I don't know, maybe you can quickly react on that, and maybe also Joan, because I think the question came in when Joan's presentation was still on.
Sure. I mean, what we found here was that there was a deep suspicion towards mapping, because people here associated mapping with demolition. Mm-hmm. It was the process that happened before they were wiped off the map. These were communities that appeared only when they were made to disappear in spectacular demolitions. So we had to come not from the technology, but come from the angle of storytelling. Because mapping was already part of a representational crisis, which was at once cartographic, political, and cultural. So we had to open a cultural space, a social space, a storytelling space in which people could understand that they could change the story. Mm-hmm. And that's why we've embedded the mapping process in a whole set of other forms of representational practice: community radio, community cinema, legal representation, political action, street campaigning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Joan, are you online?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes. Do you have something to add to Michael's statement?
Yeah, in the context of Myanmar, mapping is very, very conflictual. So actually, when we started the One Map Myanmar project, which is a big national mapping project, we faced a huge amount of contestation from local communities, ethnic groups, and civil society groups. And we haven't totally resolved that, because it's a lot of very, very valid concern. But the way we've approached it is that by providing the ability of everybody to provide feedback to whatever data we produce, that is one. The second one is really by trying to use these multi-stakeholder platforms from the very beginning of the data production process, like I've tried to explain. And the other one is really by co-designing also guiding principles for how do we map, how do we engage, how do we ensure that the people we use are really representatives of the community that they are supposed to represent. So really also, co-deciding on what are these guiding principles that should guide our actions. So these are some of the approaches that we have put in place.
Mm-hmm. And maybe another question that concerns you as well. Somebody was concerned about the idea of participation, saying that actually it is never possible to have everyone at the table when you do the participation. So how do you handle that?
We tend to talk more about collaboration than participation. Very often in participatory discourse, the facilitators somehow pretend that they're not present. They efface themselves. They're simply rendering visible other people's desires and interests. But we're clear that this is a collaboration, that we come with our own interests, our own engagements, our own expertise. And we are not focused on a shallow consensus. We're interested in creating a space for negotiation, understanding that this will be a partial and contested process, and accepting, taking the responsibility that we are participants as well. We are an interested party, and taking that responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Joanne, you mentioned that you had the government, the military, the concessions, and even the armed groups on board during your participatory processes. Can you claim to have included everyone, or do you understand the concern of this attendee who said that it is never possible to have everyone at the table when you do participation?
Definitely, our participation is very, very imperfect. For example, we take for granted that civil society groups are representing communities, which, you know, could definitely be questioned. At some point, you cannot have everybody in the room, so a process has to be decided. Now we've tried to make sure that this process was as balanced as possible, but also we are not the one who says you can come in the room or you can come in the room. It's still a government process that is being run, so we can steer it somehow, but we're not the decision makers in that. But I think that there is no such thing as a perfect representation or participation. This just doesn't exist. Once you have a group of people, then it's also trying to see how you can mitigate the imperfection of your participatory processes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just to say briefly,
yeah, sure.
Just in response to that, we try not to deal with community representatives. We try to deal with people. We try to create a space in which people can enter freely and engage freely without pretending that this is somehow a perfect representational space. And with the understanding that community representatives are very often themselves gatekeepers and very often themselves in that position by virtue of an exclusionary structure.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you can still add something to that question. I'm quickly reading it to you. Did you have to overcome any issues regarding access to the community? For example, were you invited to leave the community because they did not trust your intentions or felt you were going to use the mapping data for purposes against them?
Our access to communities was an outcome of the genesis of the project. I'd been commissioned by Amnesty International to make a video report on forced evictions in Port Harcourt. And during the research for that, I found myself with a camera in the middle of a huge forced eviction in which 19,000 people lost their homes in a single weekend. And because the camera was in the community, it wasn't behind the lines of bulldozers and police. It was positioned in the community. People immediately recognized the camera as theirs. They recognized it as an instrument that they could use to focus on what was important to them. And it demonstrated spatially where we stood, literally where we stood. And that meant that from the beginning, there was a deep level of trust and acceptance. And we were there on that day, we were there the next day, we were there the next week, we were there the next month, we were there the next year. We were there 5 years later. We're still here 9 years later.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we have to move on to the third presentation, and I would like to ask Giacomo to get himself prepared to shortly introduce himself and then to start his presentation. Giacomo, we cannot hear you.
Here.
Yes, can you start fresh, please?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Giacomo Rambaldi. I work for the Technical Center for Agriculture and Rural Cooperation, which is based in the Netherlands. I have been living and working in the south for more than 36 years, and have been engaged in participatory mapping for a long time. Setting up a community which has been promoting participatory mapping. Just referring back to the discussion which preceded my presentation, in 2005, we organized the first international conference on participatory mapping. At that time, it's maybe people forget when Google Maps, Google Earth was first launched. That was 2005. And the big concern expressed by the practitioners who attended the conference was the impact of georeferencing knowledge, georeferencing people, georeferencing belongings, assets, and so on. And as an effort of the community, a code of ethics was developed and translated in 12 languages. I think it is still valid today. So I'm passionate about participatory mapping. Also, now in the framework of my work and duties, I follow other lines of activities linked mainly to drones nowadays. But I still follow and animate the community of participatory mappers. Can I start my presentation? I think you can see my presentation.
Go ahead. Yes, we can see your presentation. Go ahead.
Okay, so I will talk a little bit about various practices which fall under the umbrella of participatory GIS, and then talk a little about experiences in the Pacific, in small island developing countries, focusing on a methodology, on a process which is called participatory 3D modeling. So just to frame what the community understands as participatory GIS, fundamentally it is a merger of what was called participatory learning and action, rapid rural appraisals, and geographic information technologies. And that happened in the 90s, and Robert Chambers was one of the promoters of rapid rural appraisal from IDS, and we added precision to the tools they were using at that time. Fundamentally, it is a practice, and I think it is important to define it as a practice. It is not a tool, because there are a lot of things which goes with practicing participatory mapping or participatory GIS. Fundamentally, it's a practice that builds on visual language, okay? So, and that is a breaking of a barrier, because you can allow people speaking different languages to communicate at the same time. It builds on multimedia and addresses multiple spatial dimensions, including time. It integrates local spatial knowledge with other data, which can be data which are retrieved from more conventional sources, from scientific sources, and where tools, different types of tools and technologies are integrated, and I will talk about that a bit later. But as Michael mentioned, video is part of mapping, photography is part of the mapping process, interviewing people is part of the mapping process, and so on. Usually participatory mapping, participatory GIS is conducted by multidisciplinary teams. It can't be done by one person. It's not a one-person show. Usually when we organize this kind of processes, we have maybe an anthropologist, a sociologist, a natural resource management specialist. When we work in coastal areas, a fishery specialist who are working with us, and obviously community representatives, local NGO activists, and so on, which link the process to the communities. And then what we have seen is that these kind of processes become very powerful when you integrate participatory video and use also social media to share the results. In which context is participatory GIS used? Community-based planning and management, awareness raising, education, social learning, advocacy, and I'm going to show a couple of slides later on about that. That's very powerful. Climate change adaptation, particularly now in small island countries, which are threatened by rising sea levels. In the Philippines and Southeast Asia, a lot of participatory mapping is done to address risk and to reduce the exposure of communities, low-lying communities, to flooding and sea rise levels. There is also a history of using participatory mapping to address conflicts, keeping in mind that drawing a line on a map may be a source of a conflict. So mapping is a very controversial process which can lead to conflict, and those who are implementing this kind of activities should be fully aware of the consequences and have plans to be able to address eventual conflicts, which may raise the moment you start defining who controls what on a map. Self-determination, we have a lot of groups, indigenous people in Southeast Asia, which have used participatory mapping to provide evidence of ancestral occupancy of land, and like in the case of the Philippines, in the framework of the law, they obtained titles. And then something which is very considered by, for example, by UNESCO at the moment, is that participatory mapping can help safeguarding ever-evolving intangible cultural heritage and help also communities build and strengthen their own identity. What you see and what you visualized through participatory mapping is what is invisible to the eyes in the sky, to the satellites, to the drones, and so on, which is who uses the resources, who controls and access these resources, and then places of historic, cultural, spiritual significance, ancestral grounds. All that is invisible from the sky. It's in the mind of the people. Gender and age-related areas, so where women are harvesting medicinal plants or are harvesting some resources, or where the harvest and control of resources is related to the age of the individuals. And then you have the toponymy. The toponymy, which normally the conventional and national cartography does not reflect, in many cases, the names used by local people, and this may lead to misunderstandings, may lead to conflicts. And then perception of hazards and risks are also invisible and just evident in the mind of the people. So I consider as participatory GIS one of the basic tool and process is just using the soil. Then you have what is called the sketch maps. The problem with sketch map is that these maps are not geo-reference, but are very useful to enhance dynamic and exchanges at community level. GIS devices, we have one system called CyberTracker, which was developed in South Africa and Namibia, and in this case is used by San people to track and position wildlife. And of course, we have seen also the use of aerial photography and also satellite images. These are a number of tools, and now I will focus on what is called participatory 3D modeling, which is a merger of traditional spatial information, meaning contours, with local spatial knowledge, mental maps, what people have in their minds. And when we talk about participation, I think that this image gives a feeling on how many people can participate in a participatory 3D modeling exercise. This picture was taken in the Cordillera in the Philippines. This is a map which shows the distribution of participatory 3D modeling exercise to the best of my knowledge. So there are hundreds and hundreds of exercises which have been conducted, and over the years I've been trying to locate and document all these exercises on a Google map. There are countries like Western Samoa where the government and the communities did a lot of exercises. Almost the entire country is reproduced in three dimensions, and then you see also in the Caribbean that the practice is widespread as well. I wanted just to mention one case. Actually, this case won the World Summit Award in 2007, and this is where local knowledge blends with the scientific knowledge. And we were working on an island in Fiji, the island of Ovalau. And this was the first exercise which was done in the Pacific, and the whole villages were involved from the whole island. And you can see here the elders convening around the blank model manufactured by students. This is a three-dimensional model to scale, 1 to 5,000 scale model, and then started populating the model. This is the blank model, and this is the process of inputting information, and this is the model 1 week later, after the input of more than 80 members of the community representing the 24 villages. What is interesting are the red pins, which are when the community developed the legend, they defined these as places of cultural significance. And as you can see, each pin has a significance, has a meaning. Each line has a meaning, and each color has a meaning. So these are the three elements of a map: the points, lines, and areas and polygons. And all this is captured on these maps. There is obviously a legend which allows people to interpret the map. For example, the big white pins are 10 households. This is one household. This is a school, and so on and so forth. Now, this is an example of a legend, very simple, with the local language and the translation in English. This is a legend made in Kenya by the Ogiek people. The data from a 3D model can be extracted using digital photography and then imported into a GIS and digitized. And then you can produce maps with this data. And now these models are extremely powerful. And this is a picture in Tonga. And this is a model of one part of the island. And I think that the postures of the people shows that they are proud of what they have done. They are proud of what they have done. This was the start of a project which then led to actions taken to preserve and better manage the environment. This is a picture taken in Ethiopia, where you see that the community members are the one talking to the policymakers in the background. So this is a reversal of roles and signifies community empowerment in explaining what outsiders usually don't know and pretend to know, the territory of the people. We have done, since Samoa was pretty interesting, we have done a study. Actually, it was Barbara, she's an Italian PhD student. She followed one of my advice, because I heard rumors that there were significant behavioral change occurring in Samoa because of the 3D modeling exercise. And so she spent a couple of months on the island talking to the people, talking to government. The old approach was top-down, government instructing people on what to do and what to plant in terms of forest reforestation and so on. And things, the rumor was that things were changing and that there was a more proactive role by government responding to requests from the communities. And she went there, and I want to just read the last paragraph of the summary. While government representatives have changed the way they approach local communities from teaching to listening, communities have also changed their attitude towards land management and development. This document, I shared it with the colleagues, and you can get a digital copy if you are interested. But fundamentally, the 3D modeling process was embraced by government. Usually it is done by, it's a counter mapping exercise where communities are trying to fight for rights and document rights vis-a-vis government. But Samoa was a pretty unique case where the government embraced the technology to have a better dialogue with the people, and the research, the PhD research, proved that to be true. I want just to show you some example of small island developing states 3D models. This is Tobago. This is Union Islands in the Caribbean. Again, Tobago, Grenada. This is in Papua New Guinea. This is in Cook Islands. This is Seychelles, and this is in Micronesia, pretty recent. And you can see how accurate these models are. Keep in mind that everything comes from the mind of the people. So except for the elevation model, which is coming from a digital elevation model, the rest is all mental maps. And Albrecht taught about tacit knowledge, and this process is a process which facilitates a lot the emergence of tacit knowledge from the community. And this is one famous model where in Samoa, where you had Helen Clark, the ex-UNDP administrator, and also the CEO of GF, admiring this model at the conference on small islands developing states. That's the end of my presentation.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. A very interesting presentation. And before we go to the Q&A with all speakers, just one question that I think could be addressed to all of you, but maybe particularly to you, Giacomo. What about post-evaluation? I mean, the products look nice, the maps look nice, the 3D models look nice, but what is the added value in the end? Does it really trigger things that would not have been possible without this approach? And added to that is the question, well, what is more important? Is it the output, is it the map or the model, or is it the process that led to establishing this model?
I scheduled my presentation to last 15 minutes, and when I was told 12, then I removed a few slides. And one slide was about impact evaluation. So we did two thorough impact evaluations, one in the Pacific and one in the Caribbean, exactly to answer your questions. And the outcome of this evaluation was extremely positive in terms of community empowerment, in terms of community cohesion, in terms of communities having a voice in negotiating access and use of resources. So, and this is why, even without us being behind activities in the Pacific, it goes on. It goes on by its own. In the Philippines, you have communities which are getting in touch with NGOs which have an experience in facilitating these kind of processes, asking them, can we do the 3D model? Now things are evolving because drone technology is added to that and so on. So it becomes more and more effective. The dialogue with institution is always based on or biased by the fact that engineers in government, they say, oh, this is inaccurate information and so on. But it has proven many times that information gathered through participatory process is more diverse, more rich, and more actual than many other information which circulates in government spaces. So the experiences we made and the studies we did show that there is a lot of positive change which is deriving from this kind of activities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's one question here that is a little bit challenging you, I suppose. The person is asking, Giacomo, do participatory 3D models and maps need to be beautiful or to be useful? I think the person was referring to the fact that you show the beauty of these models. And the same person is also asking, what are you doing differently now that drones are available?
Oh, I think that these maps are a piece of art. And it's not me who's doing them, it's the community, and they are proud of what they do. And I think that's part of the process. It's not an output, it's just a step in a process. And the more beautiful the model is, the more proud the people are. We worked with pygmies. We worked in the Sahel with pastoralists. Anybody can do that. Illiterate people. And I remember when we were working in Gabon with pygmies, they said, well, we don't know this. They never saw a map in their life, okay? And when they finished the model, the chief, one chief, Babongo chief, on camera, he said, we proved to be humans. I was shocked when he said that. Okay, I know the situation Babongo and pygmies are in Central Africa, but for him and for the community, it was so challenging. And the moment they produced this beautiful and colorful and rich repository of their own knowledge, and the governor came and shook their hand and was looking at their product, I mean, that was changing everything. And so I think that the beauty is part of the process and part of the delivery and the achievements of the people. Now, what changes if drone comes in? I think that you can produce additional information which enriches the argumentation of communities. For example, I know that there are activities, illegal mining activities, for example, in Palawan, in the Philippines, where NGOs are doing a lot of 3D models, okay? And then if there are hotspots, they use drones to film illegal activities to corroborate what the 3D models are saying.
Thanks a lot, Giacomo. I would like to ask Michael and Joanne to join, turning on their camera and their microphones, and so I can direct the questions to all of you. Let me see. There are some questions about quality. People are asking how precise do you need to be, what accuracy to aim for, generally questions about mapping quality and what to be attentive to. I don't know if any one of you wants to answer that one. More technical question in that sense.
I can listen.
Okay. Yeah, Joanne, go ahead.
I think it's a question we face all the time. I think it's really this idea of fit for purpose. There's many different outcomes that come out of participatory mapping, and you have to stick to that. In our case, we're really looking at people's land, actually even individual titles. So the level of accuracy has to be very, very, very high. In cases where you map more fluid spaces of community tenureship, then you don't need this level of accuracy. So I think this is really a very important part of the early discussion when you start the process of participatory mapping. What are you aiming at, and what kind of accuracy you need? But there's not a one fits all response to that question.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question that goes in the same direction, and that is directed to Michael. Someone is asking, how did the government accept data that they did not produce themselves? What was their response and feedback to you when you presented the mapping material that was established during the project?
Obviously, at the beginning of the project, there was a deeply and violently antagonistic relationship. But we worked really hard on overcoming that and on creating a space of engagement. And the base maps that we use, the georeference rasters, we actually got from the Office of the Surveyor General. And we now have technical cooperation agreements with the Ministry of Urban Development, Ministry of Housing, and a very close relationship with the Office of the Surveyor General.
Mm-hmm. I'm staying with you. There's somebody asking about the technology that you used, and who wanted to get a little bit more detail about how you did it practically. For example, also, were the people who participated paid, or did they do it for free? Maybe a few details, a few sentences on that.
Okay, I'm here with Barbara. I won't. She doesn't have a microphone, but Barbara's actually our lead community planner. She's an urban planner, so she can just nudge me if I get something wrong. But the initial data collection is done on Kobo Toolbox, and that's used to identify and index every single structure and every single unit and photograph visible attributes. That's entered into QGIS, and it's carried out by a team of volunteers. When they're working in the field very intensively, they get a stipend, which is about $2, and water and a meat pie. No vegetarians, and so it's very much a volunteer effort, and there's a core cohort.
I think we lost you, Michael. While we wait for the connection to be reestablished, I'm moving on to Johan. Somebody wanted to ask how, if and how, the mapping did influence products and communication by the government, policy reporting processes and things like that.
Like decisions or?
The person was specifically mentioning reporting, policy reporting.
I mean, there's some reports that have been generated on specific cases by this multi-stakeholder group. So like a investigation report with some recommendations that are then endorsed or not by the chief minister, and that are used as a basis for decisions. So that is one. Then there's all these online products that we put together with the dynamic interactive maps that are used to actually share all the information that we produce and collect feedbacks and things like this. So there's different types of products that come out of this initiative, but that are always somehow directly targeted towards some specific decisions.
Okay, I'm going to finish with a question to Giacomo. A more technical question, or I can put two together. Somebody is asking about OpenStreetMap. Would it not be easier to use that or to integrate directly the information into a digital platform? And there was another question. Let me look for it. You can maybe answer that one first while I look for the other one.
I think that the process of constructing, of making something tangible, physical, together for the community is the key. Okay, I witness so many of these processes, and the people are so engaged. When you say lunch or dinner is ready, people don't come. They keep on working on the model. We have always to have a generator because they keep on working in the night, sometimes up to 3, 4 o'clock in the night, because they want to finish the mountain, they want to do this, they want to do that. I think it goes back to the nature of people to construct something together. And it's a very bonding exercise, which you don't have if you work digitally. I am also engaged in digital mapping, in digital everything, and now everybody's digital. But going back to the simple process of constructing, of gluing, of getting dirty together, of eating together, of sitting together, is something which is very bonding. And we had so many cases. I just want to cite one Albrecht may be familiar with. The Ogiek people, when we worked with the Ogiek in Kenya, there were 21 clans. And at the end of the process, they said, we never worked together like we did. And we feel that we are much more powerful if we work and interact together rather than as individual clans. And I think that the manuality of the process, the fact that they were eating and getting dirty and sweating together, was helping a lot in the process.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I'm a little bit looking at the watch. There would be still a few other questions, but I think we have to move on with the take-home messages. And let us start then with you, Joan.
Should I share, do I share my screen or?
Yes. Isabel, can you do the switch to Joan, please?
So these are not like blanket statements that aim to apply to all participatory mapping initiatives. It's really more related to the one that I've been describing, which is a very open process with a clear beginning but not a clear end. Wait, sorry, I don't see my PowerPoint now. Yeah, so I think this, from our side, has proved that in these highly conflictual contexts, these efforts of co-producing data or knowledge can be quite a powerful tool for transformation. I see that by the only fact of having these people sitting together. You know, they usually don't, actually. When we organized the first meeting, nobody wanted to enter in the room because the level of at which the people don't like each other was so high. So we could really observe a huge transformation in this regard. And there's really a magic with maps. I think that no other tool really does that as effectively as maps. That just the most effective tool that I've seen to actually start the discussions, no matter how difficult the discussion has to be. But beyond these very positive statements, I also want to say that when we start really playing the game of really a genuine effort of co-production, of fully participatory approaches in an open-end process such as this one, it's also very, very challenging, and it requires also some features from the implementing agency, and also for those of us who are working with donor agencies, it really requires a lot of flexibility and a lot of capacity to work in adaptive management framework. And a capacity to cope with very unpredictable outcomes. Running these oil-palm processes, we had all sorts of unexpected outcomes that we had to cope with. And along the way, I think that there's as much value in the process as in the outcomes, as it was said before. And I also wanted to highlight the importance of the facilitation in this kind of process, because it really requires a very deep cultural understanding of how people behave, react, and position themselves in such a process. So in order to be able to build that level of trust that is required, the facilitation is very important, and at the same time, it's also it's where manipulation can happen. So we have to be very careful with that. If I can add a last point is we produce beautiful maps, beautiful products, but then it's really the challenge is how do you take that and put it into concrete decision making? How do you share this data with whoever has authority on the decision, and how can we be more effective in this regard?
Thank you very much. I'm moving on with Michael. Your take-home message, please.
Hi.
Hi.
So, I think really just following on from that, I mean, beyond the obvious and you know, perhaps verging on the platitudes, information is power, that while we've seen the mapping process really bring communities together and be empowering in all kinds of ways, it's very important for us to move beyond the map. And that's why our mapping program is embedded in a broader project, which includes, on the one hand, community media production, and on the other hand, public space design. We're trying to create feedback loops so that when people give their information, and the first feedback is graphic, to see it on a map, then there are these other loops, which on the one hand take them through radio or through film, where they hear their stories, and on the other hand, they begin to see their inputs shaping the spaces in which they live. And for us, that's the key challenge, to keep the map making process embedded and connected to the other forms of discursive and spatial production.
Thanks a lot for that message. To you, Giacomo.
Okay, can you see my screen? No, not yet.
Yes, we can see it.
Here.
No?
Okay, so okay, I think that the question on who will gain and who will lose in the process is a key. And the moment knowledge is visualized and georeferenced, it may expose people to risk. And map makers, participatory people who are engaged in these kind of exercises should be fully aware that they elicit something which people may have been safeguarding within their self, within the community, and make it public. And then that knowledge can be out of local control. So it is a key to define the custodian of the data and who is going to decide on what to share. Okay, so usually we work with NGOs, or what I see happening around now, these NGOs who are embedded into the community and who have GIS capacity, and which are then entrusted by the community to maintain these data sets. Okay, so the moment we collate and visualize this knowledge, we must be aware that we expose people to risk if that knowledge is not properly managed. And as part of, and this is one nice example of some work done years ago in New Zealand, where Maori people shared their knowledge. It was stored on a GIS, and some layers were considered as confidential by the community, not shareable at all, but it was important for them to document that for future generations. And we had similar cases also in Africa, the Pacific, and other places. And to that extent, at CTA, together with IFAD, we produced a training kit which goes through many different tools on participatory mapping. It's available online in English, Spanish, and it's also available in Portuguese. And these are some of the resources which are related to participatory GIS online.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to. Yes, I thought so. Thanks to you and thanks to the other speakers. I think we had really a wonderful session and very good insights. Isabel, you don't need to give me the screen. I'm not going to do any wrap up because we are close to closing time. I just would like to say that we had an attendance that peaked at 80 attendees, and we are still very high, even to the end. That means that they were not only interested at the beginning, but you also did a wonderful job during the session so that people stayed on their toes and are still around. And with that, I would like to hand over to Isabel to close the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Albi. I would like to thank to all the three speakers we had for very interesting and inspiring presentations, and I would also like to thank the audience. As always, we would like you to participate in a short survey where you can share your feedback about the webinar and also share some recommendations. And this time we would like to know, because we are actually at the end of the webinar series for practical examples, we would like to know if there is any topic which we did not cover and which you would be interested to have a webinar about. So please share this in the survey. We will share the link after this webinar through an email. And those who attended the last webinar about modeling, scenario building, and forecasting, we would like to share some of the survey results. So from the regions, half of the people were from Europe and half of the group were from other continents. Most of the people, or half of the people, had previous involvement in co-production, and half didn't have. Then 3/4 of the people were already attending the first and the second webinar, and most of the people thought that the duration of the webinar was just about right. So we are very glad to hear that. Then the question was, were the things which were presented in the third webinar new? So for the majority, they were only partly new, and for a smaller group, they were entirely new. And then we had more comments on the webinar. A small amount of people were already using the approach on spatial methods or scenario building, but about 10 people would like to use them, and maybe 9 people, they got new ideas. I think due to the interest of time, I will not go into further details, but I would like to invite those listeners who are not part yet of the Global Land Program and of the co-production working group. Please join us. You find the link on our website. And just an outlook to the upcoming webinar series. So we have an open slot in January. So please share with us in the survey ideas you have for an additional webinar. And then later on, probably in February, we'll have the synthesis workshop of this webinar series, where we elaborate a change theory for co-production of sustainable land systems. And this synthesis will then be presented at the Open Science meeting of the Global Land Program at the conference in April in 2019. So we would be happy if you join also the other webinars, and I would like to thank you once again, and goodbye from all of us.